The sound of the city was a distant hum, a muffled heartbeat miles below the glass walls of the penthouse. Rain traced silver lines down the enormous window, blurring the lights of Manhattan into a glittering tapestry. Inside, another rhythm, more urgent and human, filled the opulent silence of the bedroom. It was the sound of skin on silk, of sharp, indrawn breaths. His voice was a ragged whisper, a final, flimsy barrier against the inevitable. "Isabel, we can't. This isn't right." A low laugh, husky and rich with a certainty he had never known, answered him from the darkness. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, a touch that was both a comfort and a claim. "Shh, Leo," she murmured, her lips close to his ear, her breath warm against his skin. "Right now, nothing else matters. Just this." And as her body moved against his, the last of his resistance crumbled into dust, his protest dissolving into a surrendered groan that was part pleasure, part despair. "Oh God, Isabel." That same rain, cold and persistent, was soaking through the thin fabric of Clara's jacket as she turned the key in the lock of the cafe. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the empty street, the final, weary sound of another 16-hour day. She was Clara, 30 years old, a woman whose beauty was a soft, faded thing beneath the perpetual shadow of exhaustion. By day, she was a freelance graphic designer, her fingers flying across a keyboard to meet deadlines for clients who paid too little. By night, she was a cafe manager, her feet aching on the cold tile, her smile a practiced mask for anyone who lingered past closing. She did it all for him, for Leo. Her Leo, the brilliant, passionate artist of 31, whose talent was as undeniable as his inability to pay their rent. He was the sun she orbited, and she was the silent, tireless engine that kept his world turning. But tonight, another world was turning on its axis, in a lavish Manhattan penthouse owned by a woman named Isabel. Isabel, a gallery owner in her 40s, with a name that dripped power and a gaze that promised to build empires or destroy them. And in their small, cluttered Brooklyn apartment, the one Clara's two jobs barely paid for, the air was cold, with an absence she was only just beginning to understand was not about the late hour, but about a distance that could no longer be measured in miles. Her days began not with the sun, but with the shrill digital scream of a 5 a.m. alarm. It was a sound that sliced through the quiet dark of their small Brooklyn apartment, a sound of obligation. Beside her, Leo would stir, a soft groan escaping his lips as he burrowed deeper into the warmth of the blankets she was about to leave. She would watch him for a moment, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his handsome face peaceful in sleep, a living masterpiece she was privileged to witness. And in that moment, love and a profound weariness would wash over her in equal measure. This was the dream, she would tell herself, as she slid silently from the bed, her feet finding the cold floor. This was for the dream. Her own dreams, whatever they had once been, were now packed away in dusty boxes in the back of her mind. The first job of the day was illuminated by the cold, blue light of her laptop screen. In the tiny corner of their living room she had designated as her office, she would sit with a mug of instant coffee, the bitter taste, a familiar jolt to her system. She was a graphic designer, a creator, but there was no passion in this work. It was a relentless churn of logos for startups that would likely fail, menus for restaurants she could never afford to eat at, and real estate flyers that all promised the same empty version of luxury. She was fast, she was efficient, she was affordable, and the combination was just enough to keep a steady trickle of income flowing into their bank account. Every click of her mouse, every adjustment of a color gradient was a small, invisible brick in the foundation of Leo's artistic career. He painted with his soul. She paid the bills with hers. Around 8, the apartment would begin to stir. The smell of her cheap coffee would mingle with the faint, lingering scent of turpentine and oil paint that always clung to their home. Leo would emerge from the bedroom, stretching like a great graceful cat, all lean muscle and sleepy charm. He'd wrap his arms around her from behind as she sat at her desk, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Morning, babe," he'd murmur, his voice thick with sleep. "You've been up for hours, haven't you?" She would just nod, her eyes still fixed on the screen, her mind already calculating the invoice she needed to send. He would pour himself a coffee, wander over to the large canvas propped against the far wall, and become lost. She loved this about him, this absolute devotion to his craft. It was the reason for everything. But as he stood there, studying his work, she would feel a familiar, quiet pang of isolation. He was in his world, a world of color and light and profound meaning. She was in hers, a world of pixels and deadlines and the ever-present anxiety of next month's rent. The kiss they shared before she left for her second job was always loving, but it was fleeting, a brief connection between two ships passing in the gray light of morning. Her journey to the cafe was a descent into the city's belly. The screech of the subway, the crush of bodies, the mosaic of indifferent faces. It was here she felt most anonymous, most erased. Just another tired woman on her way to another long shift. She'd look down at her shoes, a pair of once stylish flats she'd bought 2 years ago. The soles were worn thin, the leather scuffed. There was no money for new ones. Not when Leo needed a specific, expensive brand of Belgian linen for his canvases, or a new set of sable brushes that cost more than her weekly groceries. Her sacrifice was etched into the very thing she wore, the thing she went without. The cafe was a blur of noise and motion. The hiss of the espresso machine, the clatter of ceramic, the endless stream of orders and complaints. She managed the staff, she balanced the till, she smiled at rude customers, she mopped up spilled lattes. Her lunch, if she had time for it, was always the same. A turkey and cheese sandwich, the day-old bread slightly stiff, eaten in 5 minutes in the cramped back office while she checked her emails, hoping a client had finally paid. Sometimes, on the way home, utterly drained, she would make a detour. She'd push open the heavy door of the art supply store, the little bell announcing her arrival. The smell inside was so different from the cafe. It was the smell of possibility, of clean wood and paper and pigment. It was Leo's smell. She would move through the aisles, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She knew his preferences by heart. The exact shade of ultramarine blue, he said, was the color of the sky just before a storm. The gesso he liked, thick and creamy. Tonight she saw a new set of palette knives, their steel gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She picked one up, feeling its perfect weight. She looked at the price tag and her stomach tightened. It was an indulgence, an extravagance. It was the cost of a new pair of shoes. She stood there for a long time, the cold metal in her hand, a silent battle raging within her. Then, with a soft sigh, she walked to the counter and bought it. Because seeing the joy on Leo's face when she gave it to him would, for a fleeting moment, make everything worth it. When she finally got home, well after 10, the apartment would be glowing. He'd have his single spotlight aimed at the canvas, music playing softly, a glass of cheap wine on the floor beside him. He wouldn't hear her come in, so lost was he in his creation. He was electric, energized by his work, while she felt like a battery drained down to nothing. "Clara, you're home," he'd say, finally turning, his eyes bright with passion. "Come see. I think I finally got the light right on the horizon." She would drop her bag, the heavy weight of it landing with a thud. She would force a smile, walk over, and look at the swirling colors on the canvas. She'd say, "It's beautiful, Leo, really." And she meant it. She truly did. But the words felt thin, inadequate. She couldn't see the nuances of the light he was so excited about. All she could see was a surface covered in expensive paint she had paid for, a surface that represented hours of her life she would never get back. She was too tired for art theory, too tired for deep connection. All she wanted was a hot shower and the oblivion of sleep. He felt it, of course. He wasn't oblivious. He would see the deep shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped. He would take the new palette knife from her with a surge of gratitude so intense it was painful, quickly followed by a wave of shame. He loved her for her belief in him, for her unwavering support. But that love was also a cage. Her sacrifice was a constant, unspoken indictment of his failure to provide. Every meal she paid for, every tube of paint she bought, chipped away at his sense of self. He was a man living off the strength of a woman. He was slowly, unintentionally, grinding into dust. And this feeling, this toxic cocktail of gratitude and guilt, was creating a hollow space inside him. It was a space that yearned for validation, for a sense of power, a space that was dangerously ready to be filled by someone, anyone, who saw him not as a burden to be supported, but as an artist to be worshipped. Lying in bed that night, he fell asleep almost instantly, his mind already dreaming of colors and exhibitions. Clara lay awake, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. She felt the dull ache in her back, the throb in her feet, the familiar tightness in her chest. She loved him. She loved him so much it hurt. But as she stared into the darkness, for the first time, a terrifying question whispered through the exhaustion. How much more of herself could she give before there was nothing left? The opportunity arrived not as a grand announcement, but as a quiet email on a Tuesday afternoon. It was from a small, independent gallery in Chelsea, a space known for showcasing risky, unproven talent. They were hosting a group exhibition, a chaotic collection of work from the city's emerging artists, and they had a single, last-minute spot available. A professor from Leo's art school days had remembered him and passed his name along. To the outside world, it was a minor event, a footnote in the city's sprawling art scene. To Leo, it was everything. A jolt of pure, unadulterated hope that transformed him. For a few days, the heavy cloak of frustration he usually wore was replaced by a boyish, kinetic energy that filled their small apartment. He was animated, alive, and seeing him that way, Clara felt a surge of validation for her own sacrifices. This was why she worked so hard, for this light in his eyes. This was the dream taking its first fragile breath. He had nothing to wear. His clothes were stained with paint, worn thin from years of use. The opening night was a week away, and the thought of him feeling inadequate or out of place in a room full of potential buyers and critics was something Clara could not bear. So she did what she always did. She took on more work. A mind-numbingly tedious project formatting a 100-page corporate annual report filled with charts and endless revisions. For 3 nights, she barely slept, her world shrinking to the glow of her laptop, her eyes burning from staring at the screen. The paycheck was just enough. On a Friday afternoon, she walked into a department store and bought him a suit. It wasn't designer, not the kind of thing the men in that gallery would wear without a second thought, but it was beautifully cut, a deep charcoal gray that made his eyes look even more intense. It was a tangible thing, that suit. It was woven from 3 sleepless nights, from hours of her life force, from a love so deep it constantly demanded to be translated into practical, material offerings. When she gave it to him, he held it with a kind of reverence, his gratitude so thick it was almost suffocating for them both. The gallery was a stark white box, buzzing with the particular frequency of manufactured cool. The air hummed with low conversations, punctuated by the clinking of wine glasses. It was a world built on aesthetics and connections, a world where Clara, in her one good but unremarkable black dress, felt instantly and completely invisible. She was a ghost at this feast of ambition. The artists and collectors all seemed to speak a secret language of names and references she didn't understand. She held onto Leo's arm, a small grounding anchor in a sea of intimidating strangers. His painting, a piece she adored, was titled Brooklyn Nocturne. It depicted the view from their own bedroom window on a rainy night, the streetlights smeared into melancholy streaks of gold, the buildings hunched together against the darkness. It was a canvas steeped in a loneliness she knew intimately. But here, in this bright, crowded room, it was tucked away in a corner near the restrooms, an afterthought. Then, a change in the room's atmosphere, a subtle parting of the crowd, like iron filings rearranging themselves around a powerful magnet. And through the gap, Clara saw her, Leo saw her. She was a woman who did not simply enter a room but took command of it. She wore a dress the color of expensive red wine, a sheath of silk that didn't cling to her body so much as flow over it, hinting at a figure that was mature, confident, and utterly unapologetic. Her blonde hair was swept up in a style that looked both effortless and incredibly precise. Her lips, the source of that slash of color, were a perfect, sharp crimson. It was Isabel. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her eyes scanning the art on the walls with an unnerving intensity, dismissing most of it with a glance that lasted no more than a second. Leo's breath caught in his throat as she stopped, not in front of the large, flashy, abstract piece in the center of the room, but in front of his quiet, somber cityscape in the corner. She stood there for a full minute, her head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable. Leo was frozen, his hand tightening on Clara's arm. The silence stretched, feeling longer than a lifetime. Finally, Isabel turned her head, not to the room at large, but looking directly at him, as if she had known he was there all along. Her eyes, a cool, intelligent gray, seemed to see past the cheap suit, past the nervous energy, and straight into the heart of his artistic soul. She didn't ask if he was the artist. She knew. She walked towards him, and he let go of Clara's arm to meet her. "You," Isabel said, her voice a low, melodic purr that cut through the gallery's chatter. "You haven't just painted a city. You've painted the specific ache of ambition, the terrible loneliness of being surrounded by millions of people and still feeling unseen." She gestured towards the canvas. "Most of these artists, they paint what they see. A few paint what they think they should see. You've painted what you feel." Clara, standing just a few feet away, watched as the blood rushed to Leo's face. He was stunned into silence. This woman, this stranger, had articulated the very essence of his work in a way he himself had struggled to. She had reached into the canvas and pulled out its raw, beating heart. Clara had always told him his paintings were beautiful, that he was talented, but her words were the words of a lover, warm and comforting, but ultimately simple. Isabel's words were different. They were the words of an expert, a connoisseur. They were a key, unlocking a door he had been pounding on for years. The conversation flowed after that, but it was a conversation between two people in their own universe. Clara could only watch from the periphery. He talked about his technique, his influences, his voice gaining a confidence and fervor she hadn't heard in years. He was dazzling, brilliant. He was the man she had fallen in love with, but he was shining for someone else. Then Isabel reached into her small, elegant clutch and produced a business card. "You need a proper studio. And a patron," she said, her statement sounding less like a suggestion and more like a verdict. "Call me. We should have lunch." As she handed him the small rectangle of heavy cardstock, her thumb brushed deliberately, languidly, against his open palm. It was a fleeting touch, over in an instant, but Clara saw the jolt that went through Leo's body. It was a spark in the dark, a silent contract being signed. From across the small room, holding 2 glasses of now warm, cheap white wine that she had fetched for them, Clara watched it all. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She saw the way Leo's entire posture changed, the way he leaned in, drawn into Isabel's orbit. She saw the predatory grace in the older woman's smile. This wasn't just admiration for his art. It was an appraisal. It was an acquisition. A cold dread, heavy and metallic, settled in Clara's stomach. It wasn't the simple hot sting of jealousy. It was a more profound and terrifying premonition. She was witnessing the beginning of an ending. When Leo finally came back to her side, the business card clutched in his hand like a holy relic, he was a changed man. "Clara, you won't believe it. That was Isabel Vance. The Isabel Vance." She understood my work. She really truly understood it. He was buzzing, his eyes shining with a light that had nothing to do with her. He didn't seem to notice the untouched glass of wine she offered him. He was already drunk on a far more intoxicating substance. He was drunk on hope, on validation, on the seductive promise of a world where he would finally be seen. Clara just smiled, a thin, brittle thing, and listened to him talk, and in the noisy, bright gallery, she felt the first, unmistakable tremor of the ground giving way beneath her feet. In the days that followed the gallery opening, a new name became a permanent resident in their small apartment, Isabel. The name was a constant refrain on Leo's lips, a 2-syllable mantra of his future. It began innocently enough. "Isabel thinks I should work on a larger scale," he'd say, his eyes scanning their cramped living room as if seeing its limitations for the first time. "Isabel knows a critic at the Times who would love my work." Clara would smile and nod, her heart swelling with a genuine, if slightly anxious pride. This was it. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, the validation she had worked so tirelessly to facilitate. She told herself to be happy for him, to embrace this new, powerful force in his life. The name at first sounded like hope. The first official meeting was for coffee. Leo spent an hour deciding what to wear, trying on his 2 nice shirts, asking her opinion, a nervous energy buzzing around him. She played the part of the supportive partner perfectly, ironing the collar of his shirt, giving him a kiss for luck at the door, telling him to knock them dead. She spent the next 2 hours in a state of suspended animation, unable to focus on her own design work, her stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and a vague, formless apprehension. When he returned, he was practically vibrating with energy. He talked not just about the meeting, but about the setting. It wasn't a public cafe, but Isabel's private studio in a Soho loft, a place she apparently referred to as her real office. He described the sheer size of the windows, the way the afternoon light flooded the space, the view of the city unfurling beneath them. He talked about the coffee, served in a delicate ceramic cup, brewed from some exotic beans he'd never heard of. It tasted different, he said, cleaner. He was describing a life, not just a meeting, and as Clara listened, the first cold whisper of inadequacy brushed against her soul. She thought of her own worn coffee mug, the instant coffee she drank every morning. His world was expanding, and hers, in comparison, was beginning to feel small and gray. Soon, the coffee meetings bled into the evenings, evolving into dinner meetings. She wants to discuss a 5-year plan, Clara. A real strategy, he'd explain. The justification already prepared. We can't do that in an hour. So Clara would come home from the cafe, her body aching with a familiar bone-deep fatigue, to an empty apartment. She'd make dinner for herself, the silence of the room amplifying the lonely scrape of her fork against the plate. She'd save a portion for him, covering it with foil, but by the time he came home, it would be cold and congealed on the counter, often untouched. He would arrive well past midnight, his cheeks flushed with expensive wine, his eyes bright with conversation and ideas. He was full, and she was empty. And he would bring a scent with him. It wasn't the honest smell of oil paint and turpentine. It was something else entirely, a ghost that clung to the fibers of the charcoal gray suit she had bought for him. It was a perfume. Not a cheap, obvious scent, but something complex and layered, like the woman herself. It was sandalwood and something smoky, with a faint, almost undetectable floral note underneath. It was the scent of old money, of leather-bound books, and quiet, confident power. It was the scent of Isabel. It was an invasion. It lingered in their small space, a fragrant, mocking testament to the world he now inhabited, a world she had no place in. She would hang his jacket up, her hands brushing against the lapels, and the alien fragrance would transfer to her skin, making her feel like a trespasser in her own life. His perspective began to warp, his vision tainted by the luxury he was now sampling. He didn't criticize her, not directly. He criticized their life. "The light in here is terrible," he'd complain, squinting at his canvas. "How can an artist be expected to work with this northern exposure?" He'd never complained about the light before. "Did you hear the neighbors fighting again last night?" It's impossible to think in this building. Every complaint was a dagger, and on its hilt, she could see Isabel's reflection. He was comparing his reality, their reality, to the serene, sun-drenched perfection of Isabel's loft. He was no longer just dreaming of a different life. He was actively growing to resent the one they had, the one she worked 16 hours a day to maintain. The emotional distance between them widened from a crack to a chasm. Their conversations, once filled with shared dreams and easy laughter, became logistical. "Did you mail the rent check? We're out of milk. Don't forget your dentist appointment." He was perpetually distracted, his thumb always scrolling on his phone, a small private smile on his lips. "It's Isabel," he'd say, if he caught her watching. "She's introducing me to someone." A wall was being built between them, brick by silent, illuminated brick. She felt the chill of its shadow long before she could see its full height. She found herself watching him, studying him, as if he were a stranger she was trying to figure out. The way he now held his wine glass, the new words that had crept into his vocabulary, the casual mention of restaurants she knew they could never afford. He was changing, shedding his old skin for a new, shinier one, and she was being left behind with the discarded molt. She tried to fight the feeling, to reason with the cold dread that coiled in her gut. She told herself she was being selfish, insecure. This was his big break. She should be his biggest cheerleader, not an anchor of doubt. What kind of partner was she if his success made her feel threatened? This internal battle was exhausting, a third job she hadn't signed up for. But the rationalizations felt thin and hollow against the stark reality of her loneliness. One night, he was sketching on the sofa while she paid bills at the small desk. His phone rang, and she saw the name flash on the screen. Isabel. He immediately stood up and walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. The murmur of his voice was just audible, a low, intimate hum. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tone. It was a voice she hadn't heard him use in a long time. It was eager, deferential, laced with a warmth and intimacy that was, until recently, reserved only for her. He laughed at something she said, a soft, private laugh that twisted the knife in Clara's heart. She was sitting 10 feet away, but she had never felt farther from him. When he came back into the room, he was smiling. "Good news," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Isabel thinks she's found a potential buyer for the nocturne." He didn't notice the tears welling in her eyes. He didn't see that her hands were trembling. He saw only the bright, shining path Isabel was laying before him. Later that night, as they lay in bed, the silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He was on his side, his back to her, and she could feel the rigid line of his body, a physical manifestation of the new boundary between them. He fell asleep quickly, a faint, contented sigh escaping his lips as he drifted off into dreams of his promising new future. Clara lay awake, staring into the darkness, the scent of another woman's perfume, a ghostly presence in their bed. The physical space between them was only inches, but she knew with a certainty that made it hard to breathe, that she was sleeping next to a man who had already left. The seeds of distance had taken root, and their insidious growth was silently, relentlessly, tearing their world apart. The arrangement was presented as an act of pure professional generosity. "You can't create monumental work in a shoebox, Leo," Isabel had said, a dismissive wave of her hand banishing their entire Brooklyn apartment from existence. She offered him a corner of her Soho studio. It wasn't a gift, she insisted, but an investment in his talent. The logic was impeccable, irrefutable. Clara, wanting only the best for him, had agreed it was an opportunity he couldn't refuse, her heart sinking even as she smiled and helped him pack a bag with his essential brushes and paints. So his nights changed. Instead of painting in their cluttered living room, with the sounds of the city and Clara's quiet presence in the background, he now worked in a vast, cathedral-like space. A place of profound silence, broken only by the scrape of his knife on the palette and the distant, mournful cry of a siren. The quality of the light, even at night from the track lighting she'd had professionally installed, was perfect. The sheer luxury of space, of being able to step back 20 feet to view his canvas, was intoxicating. But it was the air itself that was most different. His own familiar, earthy smells of turpentine and linseed oil were there, but they were no longer dominant. They were now just one layer in a much more complex fragrance profile. The entire studio was infused with Isabel's scent. That signature perfume of sandalwood and smoke was everywhere. It seemed to have been absorbed into the wooden floors, the plush velvet of the sofas, the very air he breathed. It was a constant, subtle reminder of who was in charge, of whose world he was now a privileged guest in. The scent of his work and the scent of her power had mingled, creating something new and dangerously alluring. It was the smell of his dream being realized, and it smelled exactly like her. She was rarely there when he arrived, but she would often appear late in the evening, moving through the cavernous space with a silent, fluid grace. She wouldn't interrupt him, not at first. She would pour herself a glass of deep red wine, the glugging sound from the bottle echoing slightly in the quiet room, and settle onto a leather armchair in the far corner. She'd read or look at her phone, but he could always feel her eyes on him. Her presence was a quiet, constant pressure. It made him work with a ferocious intensity he hadn't felt in years. He was performing, he realized. He was painting for an audience of one, and her judgment was the only one that mattered. The need for her approval was a hunger, a thirst that eclipsed all else. Tonight, the city was quiet, wrapped in a thick autumn fog. Leo was lost in his work, wrestling with a difficult passage of shadow and light on a canvas that was, as she demanded, monumental. He didn't hear her get up. He only knew she was there when her shadow fell across his painting. He turned, startled. She stood just behind him, holding her wine glass, her head tilted as she studied his work. She was wearing a simple, cream-colored silk blouse. Under the focused beam of the studio spotlight, the fabric became almost translucent, a delicate veil over the faint, shadowy outline of the black lace she wore beneath. The top two buttons were undone, a casual, careless gesture that revealed the elegant line of her collarbone. It was an intimacy that felt both accidental and entirely deliberate. "You're fighting it," she said, her voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Her critique was, as always, brutally perceptive. "The darkness here, it should be a void, a true absence. But you're filling it with detail, with fear. You need to let it consume the light. Be bolder." She leaned forward, pointing with a long, elegant finger, her nail, a perfect slash of crimson. To point, she had to get closer, and the warmth of her body radiated against his back. He could smell the wine on her breath, a rich, fruity aroma mixed with her perfume. He held his own breath, his knuckles white where he gripped his brush. "Here," she whispered, her voice dropping even lower. "Let me show you." And then it happened. Her free hand came to rest on his shoulder. It was not a casual pat or a friendly squeeze. It was a gesture of ownership. He felt the shock of it, a jolt that went straight down his spine. Her palm was warm, the pressure of her fingers firm and knowing through the thin cotton of his t-shirt. As she leaned in, her body shifted, and the soft curve of her breast pressed against his shoulder blade. There was no mistaking it. It was a clear, undeniable, intimate touch. The air crackled. The studio, the canvas, the entire city of New York dissolved, and his universe shrank to the 3 points of contact. Her hand on his shoulder, her body against his back, and her scent filling his head. A wild panic, mingled with a dark, exhilarating thrill, surged through him. Every instinct screamed at him to pull away, to put space between them, to reestablish the boundary of student and mentor. But he was paralyzed, held captive by the sheer audacity of her touch. Her lips were now so close to his ear, her voice was a breath, a vibration he felt more than heard. "You have so much passion, Leo." The word hung in the air, shimmering with double meaning. "It's in every stroke. I can feel the force of it from across the room." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "It's intoxicating." He felt a tremor go through his body, a response he couldn't control. She wasn't just talking about the painting anymore, she was talking about him. "A man shouldn't keep that much fire contained," she finished, the whisper a direct challenge, a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. She was validating him not just as an artist, but as a man, a force, a vessel of the very passion that he felt had been draining away in his life of obligation. Slowly, as if moving through a dream, he turned his head. Her hand didn't move from his shoulder. It tightened slightly, holding him in place. They were face to face, the space between them so small he could see the faint dusting of powder on her skin, the tiny, intricate lines around her intelligent gray eyes. He saw his own reflection, small and captivated, in the dark pools of her pupils. The pretense of an art lesson was gone, incinerated in the heat of this proximity. All that remained was the raw, humming tension between them. He could smell the wine on her lips, a sweet, forbidden invitation. Her gaze held him, searching, questioning, and commanding all at once. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, each beat a wordless question. The silence was absolute, a perfect vacuum filled with nothing but the devastating possibility of what would happen next. The silence in the studio stretched taut between them, a high-tension wire humming with unspoken words. Leo stood frozen, trapped in the cool, assessing gaze of Isabel's eyes. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, his soul laid bare and examined. The air was thick, heavy, and then, as if on cue from a masterful director, the world outside shattered. A brilliant fork of lightning bleached the city white for an instant, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to lash against the enormous windows, a sudden, violent onslaught. The storm had broken, and with it, something inside Leo. Isabel didn't flinch. She simply smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her perfect red lips. "The storm is here," she said, her voice calm and steady above the rising fury of the wind. "You're not going anywhere tonight." It wasn't an invitation, it was a statement of fact, a declaration. The spell of their charged confrontation was broken, but the electricity remained, now mingling with the tempest outside. She turned away from him, moving back towards the seating area, her movements unhurried. Forget the painting for now, she called over her shoulder. Let's have a real drink. He followed her as if pulled by an invisible string, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The canvas, his work, his supposed purpose for being there, now seemed like a foolish, flimsy prop in a much larger, more dangerous play. She poured 2 glasses of amber-colored liquid this time, something that smelled of smoke and peat. Scotch. She handed him a heavy crystal tumbler. To bold decisions, she said, her eyes meeting his over the rim of her glass. The conversation that followed was different. The pretense of mentor and student was stripped away, leaving something far more raw and intimate. She didn't talk about art theory or gallery contacts. She asked him about his life, about the gnawing fear of failure that kept him awake at night, about the audacious, secret dreams he'd never dared to speak aloud, not even to Clara. He found himself confessing things he hadn't known he felt, the expensive scotch loosening his tongue and his inhibitions. She, in turn, offered him carefully chosen fragments of her own story, tales of risks taken and battles won in a world that tried to dismiss her. She was seducing his ambition, his intellect, his starved ego. She made him feel not like a struggling artist, but like a misunderstood genius on the cusp of greatness, and she was the only one in the world who could see it. The storm raged, a wild symphony of wind and rain that cocooned them in the warm, dim light of the studio. She rose to pour another drink, and on her way back, she stopped behind the chair where he sat. Her hands came to rest on his shoulders, and she began to knead the tight, knotted muscles there. "You carry so much tension, Leo," she murmured, her thumbs pressing deep into the base of his neck. "It's a block. It kills creativity. You have to let it go." He closed his eyes, his head falling forward in involuntary surrender. Her touch was expert, confident, sending waves of heat through his body. He should have told her to stop. He should have stood up. But he did nothing. He just sat there, pliant and weak, allowing himself to be ministered to. Then she moved, circling around to stand in front of him. She knelt slightly, bringing their faces level. "Let me help you," she whispered. Her hands went to the buttons of his paint-stained shirt. He watched, mesmerized, as her long, nimble fingers undid the first, then the second. Her knuckles brushed against the skin of his chest, a touch as light as a moth's wing, but it seared him like a brand. It was then that a final, desperate alarm bell went off in the deepest part of his soul. He flinched back, scrambling to his feet, putting the chair between them. The name came out of his mouth like a prayer, a talisman against this overwhelming temptation. "Isabel, please," he choked out, the words tasting like ash. "I have Clara." The name hung in the opulent air of the studio, sounding fragile and out of place. It was a word from a different world, a world of worn-out shoes and cold dinners and 16-hour workdays. Isabel didn't recoil. She didn't argue. She simply held his gaze, her expression a mixture of pity and predatory patience. She rose to her full height and took one slow, deliberate step towards him, then another, until the chair was no longer a barrier. She was so close now he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Clara isn't here," she said, her voice a soft, devastating blade of logic that severed his final tie to loyalty. And with that, she raised her hand, not to touch his chest, but to cup the side of his face, her thumb stroking his jawline. She leaned in and captured his mouth with hers. The kiss was not a question. It was an answer. It was a torrent of pent-up desire and calculated possession, and it washed away the last of his resolve. For a single, agonizing moment, his body was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, a final, futile act of resistance. Then, with a groan that was torn from the very depths of him, he surrendered, his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her hard against him, his own kiss becoming as hungry and desperate as hers. It was a point of no return, a leap into a gorge, and the fall was both terrifying and exhilarating. The journey to her bedroom, in a section of the loft he hadn't seen, was a blur of tangled limbs and frantic, stolen breaths. He kicked the door shut behind them. She turned in his arms, and with a flick of her wrists, the buttons of her silk blouse gave way. The garment slithered from her shoulders and pooled at her feet, a puddle of cream in the dim light. As the outline had foretold in his deepest, most forbidden thoughts, she wore black lace beneath. It was a stark, erotic contrast against the pale, luminous skin of her body, a body that was not a girl's, but a woman's, confident in its power and its pleasures. Her breasts were full and round, barely constrained by the delicate fabric. He stared, his mind reeling with the sheer, unadulterated reality of his transgression. As they fell onto the vast, cool sheets of her bed, he squeezed his eyes shut, trying to find a moment of clarity, a reason to stop. But the image that flooded his mind was not of Isabel. It was Clara. It was her face, exhausted and pale under the harsh fluorescent lights of the cafe, forcing a smile for him when he knew she was aching. The image should have stopped him, should have filled him with a righteous shame. Instead, it did something terrible and perverse. The wave of self-loathing that washed over him was so intense, it became a catalyst, fueling a wild, punishing desperation in his passion. It was as if by desecrating this moment, by making it more intense, he could somehow atone for the betrayal, burning it out of his system. His movements became urgent, almost violent, a frantic attempt to outrun his own conscience. Her soft moans mingled with the sound of the rain against the glass. "Leo." "Oh, yes," she breathed, her body arching to meet his. And as the storm outside and the storm inside him reached their deafening crescendo, a single broken whisper escaped his lips, a confession and a plea all at once. "Isabel, forgive me." The thunder cracked again, but he barely heard it. He was already lost in the deafening silence of the aftermath, lying in another woman's bed, the weight of what he had just done beginning its slow, crushing descent. The journey home was a descent. As the first gray, watery light of dawn began to seep into the sky, Leo sat in the back of a taxi, watching the sleeping boroughs of New York slide past the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt unnaturally clean, the streets washed bare, the air crisp and cold. It was a stark, cruel contrast to the thick layer of filth he felt coating his own soul. He was a ghost moving through a city that was just beginning to wake up, a creature of the night slinking back to his life before the sun could expose him. His body was a war zone of conflicting sensations, the lingering phantom touch of Isabel's hands on his skin, the dull ache of physical exertion, and a nauseating, acidic guilt churning in the pit of his stomach. He rehearsed the lie in his head, turning the words over and over until they lost all meaning and became just sounds. The storm was bad. My phone died. I crashed at the studio. It sounded plausible. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like something a monster would say. He paid the driver and crept up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, his key sliding into the lock with an impossibly loud click. He prayed she would be asleep, that he could just slip into bed, and in the morning, the night would feel like a sordid, half-forgotten dream. But the moment he stepped inside, he knew he would not be so lucky. The air in the apartment was still and heavy with the energy of a long, sleepless vigil. The familiar scent of their life, his oil paints, the lingering aroma of the coffee Clara had brewed yesterday, the simple, clean smell of their laundry detergent rushed at him, and for a moment, he felt like he was going to be sick. These were the scents of home, of love, of the life he had just irrevocably fractured. They were no longer comforting, they were accusatory. His first desperate instinct was for the bathroom. He needed to wash her off of him. It was a primal, urgent need, a baptism and an exorcism all in one. He stripped off his clothes, leaving them in a guilty pile on the floor, and stepped into the shower, turning the water on as hot as he could stand it. Under the harsh glare of the single bathroom bulb, he avoided looking at himself in the steamed-up mirror, unable to face the reflection of the man who had done this. He grabbed their bar of soap, a cheap generic brand that smelled faintly of oatmeal, and began to scrub his skin with a frantic, punishing energy. He washed his hair, his face, his chest, trying to erase the memory of her sandalwood body wash, her expensive lotions, the scent of her skin. He was trying to wash away her touch, her taste, her scent, trying to scour his body clean of the evidence of his sin. He was trying to become himself again, the man who had left this apartment yesterday morning, but he knew, with a sinking certainty, that man was gone forever. When he finally stepped out, his skin red and raw, a towel wrapped around his waist, he walked into the bedroom, and she was there. She wasn't sleeping. She was sitting up in bed, her knees drawn to her chest, the worn quilt wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She was just sitting there, a small, still figure in the pale morning light, and her eyes were fixed on him. They were not angry or accusatory. They were worse. They were just watching. The silence was absolute, a thick, pressurized void that seemed to suck all the air from his lungs. In her stillness, he saw the entirety of her night, the hours of waiting, of calling his dead phone, of listening to the storm rage outside, and imagining 100 different terrible scenarios, never once landing on the mundane, sordid truth. The storm was crazy, he began, the rehearsed lie tumbling out of his mouth, sounding flimsy and pathetic in the heavy silence. My phone died. I figured it was better to crash on the cot at the studio than try to get home. He tried to make his voice sound casual, tired, but he couldn't meet her eyes. He focused on opening a drawer, pulling out a clean t-shirt, his movements stiff and unnatural. He felt her gaze on him, a physical weight on his back. He was a terrible actor, and she was the most important audience of his life. He walked past the bed to get to the closet, and for a fleeting moment, he was close enough for her to catch his scent. It was then that her world, which had been teetering on a precipice all night, finally plunged into the abyss. It wasn't the smell of another woman's perfume. He had been clever enough or panicked enough to wash that away. It was something far more intimate, far more damning. It was the soap. Beneath the familiar, faint scent of their own oatmeal soap, there was another fragrance clinging to his skin, a clean, sharp, botanical smell. It was expensive. It was complex. It was the scent of a different life, a different bathroom, a different home. It was the kind of soap found in a luxury loft in Soho, not in a third-floor walk-up in Brooklyn. It was a detail so small, so specific, and so irrefutable that it broke her heart with a quiet, devastating finality. All the frantic hope she had clung to throughout the night that his phone had really died, that he had just worked late and fallen asleep, evaporated in that single, subtle inhalation. Suspicion hardened, instantly, into a cold, diamond-hard certainty. He turned back to her, now dressed in clean clothes, a hollow man performing a pantomime of normalcy. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, the mundane question, an act of spectacular cruelty. Clara looked at him, at this man she loved, this man she had built her entire world around, and she saw a stranger. She saw the lie sitting plainly on his face. She saw the guilt flickering deep in his eyes, and she saw the truth, a truth so monstrous and so painful that to speak its name would be to unleash a devastation she was not, in that moment, strong enough to survive. Confronting it now, on no sleep, with the sun rising on another day where she had to go to work and pretend that everything was fine, felt like an impossibility. So she made a choice. She swallowed the jagged shards of her shattered heart, pushed the monster back down into the darkness, and lied. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself. "Yeah," she said, her voice a monotone, a flat line on a heart monitor. "I was just worried." He visibly relaxed, the tension draining from his shoulders. He thought he had done it. He thought he had gotten away with it. He walked over and leaned down to kiss her forehead, and she had to use every ounce of her strength not to flinch away from his touch. His lips were warm, but all she could feel was a tomb-like cold. "I'll make coffee," he said, turning away, eager to escape the charged atmosphere of the bedroom. She watched him go. The lie now hung in the air between them, a thick, poisonous fog. He had betrayed her with his body, and now he had betrayed her with his words. And she, in her silence, in her pained, desperate pretense, had just become complicit in the deception. The scent of the expensive soap was already fading from his skin, but Clara knew, with a chilling certainty, that she would smell the betrayal for the rest of her life. The first time had been a fall, a chaotic, guilt-ridden stumble into transgression. The second time was a choice. It was a deliberate, calculated step taken with eyes wide open. The guilt that had clawed at Leo in the days following his night with Isabel did not disappear. Instead, it festered, curdling into something else: justification. He began to see Clara's quiet sadness, her withdrawn presence, not as a result of his betrayal, but as a reproach, a weight he was forced to carry. Her love, once his sanctuary, now felt like the four walls of his prison. He was an artist, he told himself, and an artist needs fuel, needs experience, needs to live on a grander scale than their small, cramped life allowed. He recast his infidelity in the grand, dramatic light of artistic necessity. Isabel was not just a lover, she was his patron, his muse, his key to the future. And this clandestine arrangement, was simply part of the price of greatness. The self-deception was a powerful opiate, dulling the sharp edges of his conscience. But beneath it all was a simpler, more primal truth. He craved her. He was addicted to the memory of her touch, the taste of her power, and the exhilarating, selfish release she offered. The invitation came 4 days later, not as a call, but as a text message. It was brief, imperious, and utterly thrilling. The Carlisle, Friday, 8 p.m., Suite 1, 201. There was no question. No, are you free? It was an instruction, a summons. All week, he moved through his life with Clara like a phantom, his body present in their apartment but his mind already elsewhere, rehearsing the moment he would step into that hotel. He was distant, irritable, his lies becoming more frequent and more fluid. He was creating the space he needed to exist in two separate worlds, and the effort was making him a stranger in his own home. On Friday evening, he told Clara he was meeting a potential collector Isabel had arranged, a dinner that could go late. The lie felt effortless now, a well-worn groove in his mind. He dressed with meticulous care, not in the suit she had bought him, that felt like a profanity. He couldn't yet commit, but in a new shirt and trousers he had bought with cash from a small painting sale Isabel had brokered for him. He was already using her money to facilitate his deception. He kissed Clara goodbye at the door, her cheek cool against his lips, her eyes searching his for something that was no longer there. For a moment, her sad, trusting gaze almost broke him. Almost. But the pull of the Carlisle, the promise of Suite 1201, was stronger than the pull of his own history. The hotel lobby was a hushed cathedral of wealth. The carpets muffled his footsteps. The air was scented with lilies and old money. Everything was designed to create a sense of seamless, soundproofed privacy. This was a place built for secrets. When he knocked on the door of Suite 1201, he felt a tremor of anticipation, the thrill of the addict about to get his fix. The door swung open, and she was there. She wore a simple, sleeveless black dress that ended just above the knee, her only adornment a string of pearls at her throat. She looked powerful, elegant, and utterly in control. Without a word, she stepped back to let him in. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind him, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no pretense this time, no nervous conversation about art. He dropped his keys on the marble entryway table, and she was in his arms, her mouth finding his in a kiss that was not a discovery, but a reclamation. It was a kiss of mutual, knowing hunger. There was no resistance, no hesitation. He was not a man falling from grace. He was a man enthusiastically leaping into the fire. The suite was magnificent, with a panoramic view of Central Park's glittering darkness, but they barely saw it. A bottle of champagne sat chilling in a silver bucket, but they ignored it. This encounter was not the frantic, desperate coupling of their first night. This was a slow, deliberate indulgence, an unhurried exploration of a newly claimed territory. They moved to the bedroom, their clothes coming off not in a rush, but with a languid, sensual purpose. He was mesmerized by her body, no longer seeing it through a haze of guilt, but with the clear, appreciative eye of a lover and an artist. He admired the confident curve of her hips, the pale, smooth skin of her stomach, the strength in her back. He traced the line of her spine with his fingertips, feeling the power held within her mature, elegant form. "You are exquisite," he whispered, the words, a reverent truth. She, in turn, explored him with a practiced, confident touch that made him feel seen and worshipped in a way he had never been. Her hands knew how to find pleasure, how to build it, how to sustain it. This was not the tender, familiar lovemaking he shared with Clara. This was a purely carnal act, elevated to an art form. Lying on the impossibly soft sheets, the city lights a distant, blurry backdrop, he felt a sense of profound, physical rightness. "Isabel," he breathed, his voice thick with pleasure, as her body moved with his. "You feel incredible." She smiled, a slow, cat-like smile in the dim light. She leaned close, her lips brushing against his ear as she answered, her words a promise that was both a gift and a leash. "Tell me what you want, Leo," she whispered, her voice a husky purr. "Tell me everything you've ever wanted. I'll give it to you." In that moment, he believed her. She was not just a woman. She was a gatekeeper to a world of sensation, of power, of success. To be with her was to become a part of that world. He gave himself over to it completely, his own responses becoming more vocal, more uninhibited. He praised her body, her touch, the feelings she evoked in him. He described the curve of her waist, the surprising firmness of her buttocks, his hands tracing the lines as he spoke. They were two hedonists, locked in a luxurious, soundproofed bubble, dedicated solely to the pursuit of mutual pleasure. The sounds in the room were not of guilt or apology, but of pure, unadulterated sensation, soft moans, sharp intakes of breath, whispered words of encouragement and desire. In the quiet aftermath, they lay entangled, their bodies slick with sweat, the rhythm of their breathing slowly returning to normal. There was no frantic rush to dress, no crushing weight of immediate regret. There was only a languid, sated peace. He looked at the city lights, feeling 1,000,000 miles away from his real life, from the woman waiting for him in Brooklyn. The guilt was not gone. He knew it was there, waiting for him outside the heavy door of this suite, but for now, it was a distant, muffled sound. In its place was a feeling of potent, terrifying satisfaction. He looked at Isabel, who was watching him with a contented, proprietary look in her eyes. He had made a deliberate choice, a conscious indulgence, and in doing so, he had stepped fully into his new role. He was no longer Clara's struggling artist. He was Isabel Vance's lover. And in the silent, decadent luxury of that hotel room, it felt less like a betrayal and more like a destiny. The illusion of their life together had become a threadbare sheet, and Clara could no longer pretend not to see the gaping holes. The trust she had once placed in Leo, a faith as solid and foundational as the ground beneath her feet, had eroded into a fine, choking dust. It was in the small things, the 1,000 tiny cuts that bled her hope dry. It was in the way his phone was now perpetually angled away from her, the screen going dark the moment she entered a room. It was in the vague, impenetrable wall of his explanations for his late nights meetings, studio sessions, networking events, a fog of professional obligations she could never verify. It was in the chilling absence of intimacy, the way he would kiss her cheek with the dutiful affection of a distant relative. The breaking point was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, final turn of his back. He was on the phone, his voice a low, intimate murmur, and as she walked into the living room, he physically turned away, hunching his shoulder, as if to shield the conversation from her very presence. In that small, dismissive gesture, she saw everything. She was no longer a partner. She was an obstacle, an intruder in the new, more important life he was building. The pretense was over. She could no longer wait for the truth to be offered. She had to find it for herself. Her search began the next afternoon while he was at the studio. The very act felt like a transgression, a violation of the woman she thought she was. Her hands trembled as she performed this quiet trespass in the home that was supposed to be their shared sanctuary. She felt like a thief, her heart hammering against her ribs with a sick rhythm of guilt and desperation. She started with his clothes, the pockets of the jacket he'd worn the night before. Her fingers closed around crumpled receipts for coffee, a ticket stub from a movie he'd supposedly seen alone, nothing. She checked his wallet, her stomach churning, and found only the usual collection of cards and a few dollars. The lack of evidence was almost worse, making her feel foolish, paranoid. Was she imagining it all? Was she the one who was breaking their life apart with her unfounded suspicions? She was about to give up, to sink onto the sofa and surrender to the misery of her own uncertainty, when she saw the day's mail on the small entryway table. He usually sorted through it, but he must have been in a hurry. A white envelope with the familiar logo of their bank was on top, a joint credit card statement. Her name was on it too. She had every right to open it. It was her money, mostly, that paid the bill each month. Her fingers fumbled with the seal, her breath held tight in her chest. She unfolded the crisp paper, her eyes scanning the columns of dates and charges, looking for nothing in particular, just performing the mundane task of checking their finances, and then she saw it. A single-line item from 2 weeks prior. The merchant, the Carlisle Hotel, the charge, $573. The Carlisle. The name sounded expensive, exclusive, a place from a different universe, a universe of silk dresses and perfectly applied lipstick, a charge for restaurant and services. She tried to reason with the immediate sickening lurch in her stomach. A mistake, she thought wildly. A gift for someone? A work event he forgot to mention? But her mind, cruel and efficient, immediately cross-referenced the date. It was the night he'd told her about the dinner with the important collector, the night he hadn't come home until 3 in the morning. The first thread of his carefully woven narrative had just been pulled, and the entire fabrication was beginning to unravel. The statement was proof of a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth. She needed to understand. With a cold dread solidifying in her veins, she walked over to the sofa where his laptop lay, still open from when he'd been answering emails that morning. He had become careless. Or maybe, she thought with a fresh wave of nausea, he just no longer feared being caught. This was the final boundary to cross, opening his private emails. She hesitated for only a second, the woman she used to be making, one last feeble protest. Then she sat down, the cushions sighing under her weight, and placed her trembling fingers on his trackpad. His email was already open. Her eyes scanned the list of messages, and it didn't take long to find them. There was a chain, 10 emails deep, with Isabel Vance. The subject line was a sterile, professional mask. FWD, strategy. Her finger clicked, and the thread opened. As the outline of her deepest fears had predicted, they were not explicit. They were far, far worse. They were intimate. They were casual. They were coded with the easy language of lovers who share a secret world. The first one she read was from Isabel, dated the morning after the hotel charge. Last night was incredibly productive. We should be so productive again soon. Leo's reply, couldn't agree more. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on my work today. Another from Isabel a few days later, thinking about our discussion of negative space. You've given me a new and profound appreciation for it. His response, it's all about what you choose to reveal and what you choose to hide. Each line was a perfectly polished stone dropped into the still, deep well of Clara's heart. The words were a masterclass in plausible deniability, each one ostensibly about art and their professional collaboration. But the subtext, the intimate, suggestive current running beneath the surface, was unmistakable. This wasn't the fumbling correspondence of a one-time mistake. This was the ongoing dialogue of an affair, a shared life being lived in emails and expensive hotel rooms, parallel to the one she thought was hers. The final email, the one that made the air leave her lungs in a silent rush, was from Isabel. I've left that book we discussed at the front desk of the Carlisle for you. It's under my name. Let me know when you've picked it up. The hotel, the confirmation, the last shred of doubt was incinerated. As she stared at the screen, the words blurring into meaningless black marks, a strange and terrible thing happened. The world went quiet. The distant sound of traffic from the street below faded away. The hum of the refrigerator ceased. The frantic, painful beating of her own heart seemed to stop. She was not engulfed by a hot wave of rage or a crushing tsunami of sorrow. Instead, a profound and terrifying numbness spread through her, a psychic novocaine that deadened everything. It was the sensation of the floor falling away, of gravity ceasing to exist. The life she had been living, the sacrifices she had made, the man she loved, it was all a fiction, a story she had been telling herself, while the real story was being written in secret emails and hotel suites. The pain was too vast, too absolute to be processed as an emotion. It was simply a state of being. It was the end of the world, happening not with a bang, but with a silent digital whisper. Slowly, her movements robotic and detached, she closed the laptop. The soft click echoed in the crushing silence. She picked up the credit card statement, the paper feeling impossibly heavy in her hand, as if it contained the full weight of his betrayal. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. The tears would not come. She simply sat on their sofa, in the middle of their life, which was now a crime scene. She sat, and she waited for the man she no longer knew to come home, no longer his partner, but a silent, hollowed-out witness to the absolute ruin he had made of them. The thread had unraveled completely, and she was now entangled in the wreckage. The hours passed in a slow, syrupy procession. Clara didn't move from the sofa. She watched the afternoon light fade from gold to a bruised purple, the shadows in their small apartment lengthening and deepening until the room was almost completely dark. She didn't turn on a lamp. She sat in the gloom, a silent sentinel in the ruins of her own life. The numbness that had initially cocooned her began to recede, and in its place, a strange and terrible calm settled over her. It was the calm at the eye of a hurricane, a pocket of profound stillness before the final, destructive fury was unleashed. The credit card statement lay on the coffee table, its white paper seeming to glow in the twilight. It was a single stark fact in a world that had become an elaborate fiction. It was the anchor to her new, terrible reality. She heard his keys in the lock just after 8. The sound, once a comfort, now sent a jolt of ice through her veins. He stepped inside, humming softly to himself, a man returning from a productive day in his own burgeoning universe. "Clara?" he called out, his voice cheerful. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" He flicked on a light, and the sudden glare made her flinch. He saw her then, truly saw her, and his smile faltered. He saw her stillness, her pale face, the unnatural rigidity of her posture. "What is it?" he asked, his tone shifting from casual to cautious. "What's wrong?" She didn't speak. She couldn't. The words were trapped behind a wall of grief and rage. Instead, she slowly lifted a trembling hand and pointed to the piece of paper on the table. He followed her gesture, his brow furrowed in confusion. He picked up the statement. She watched his eyes scan the page, watched the flicker of recognition, the instant fleeting panic, and then the rapid, chilling construction of a mask of nonchalance. It was like watching a master craftsman at work, building a fortress of lies in a matter of seconds. "Oh, this," he said, his voice a little too light. He gave a small, dismissive laugh. "Is that what this is about?" It was a gallery function. Isabel booked a room for some out-of-town clients, some big collectors from Germany. She must have put it on my card by mistake. "She's already paid me back for it, don't worry." The lie was smooth, detailed, designed to make her feel insane. For a heart-stopping moment, she almost believed him. She wanted to believe him. But then she thought of the emails, of the coded intimacy, of the cold dread she'd felt all afternoon. The desire to believe him was drowned by the tidal wave of his betrayal. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was a dry, rasping whisper she barely recognized as her own. "And the emails, Leo?" she asked, her eyes never leaving his face. Was our discussion of negative space a mistake too? The blood drained from his face. The fortress of his lie crumbled into dust. He was caught, utterly and completely caught. And in that moment, the cornered animal inside of him chose not to surrender, but to attack. His fear and guilt erupted into a sudden, white-hot fury. "You went through my things?" He spat, his voice rising to a shout. "You went through my private emails? What the hell gives you the right to do that, Clara?" He threw the paper down on the table. "This is what I'm talking about. I have no privacy, no space to breathe." The blame shifted, turning on her with a vicious, stunning velocity. "Maybe if you were ever actually here," he sneered, his gesture encompassing the whole apartment, their whole life. "Maybe if you ever tried to understand my world instead of just paying for it, I wouldn't need someone else to talk to. You think love is just paying the rent? You think your sacrifice buys you the right to own me? It doesn't. It's a cage, Clara. This whole life you've built for us is a goddamn cage." Every word was a physical blow. To have her love, her sacrifice, the 16-hour days, the worn-out shoes, the sleepless nights twisted into a weapon and used against her was a cruelty she could not have imagined. And in that moment, the dam broke. The years of exhaustion, the months of quiet heartbreak, the silent screams she had swallowed, all of it erupted out of her in a single ragged cry of pure animal pain. "A cage?" she shrieked, her voice cracking, the sound tearing from her throat. "I built this cage with my own 2 hands, day after day, so you could be free to play with your fucking paints." The rage was a fire, burning away the numbness, the sadness, everything. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on one of his finished canvases propped against the wall. It was a smaller study for his nocturne, the very first one, a piece she had loved, a piece born in this apartment, on a canvas she had paid for. With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged for it, her hands closing around the rough wood of the frame. "Is this your world, Leo?" she screamed. "This world I'm not a part of." And with all the force of her broken heart, she hurled it against the opposite wall. The sound was shockingly violent in the small room. A sharp, splintering crack as the wooden frame shattered, the canvas tearing with a sickening rip. The painting, their shared dream, slid to the floor, a broken, ruined thing. The sound shocked them both into a sudden, stunned silence. They both stared at the wreckage on the floor, the shattered mirror of their relationship. The violence of the act seemed to drain all the fight out of Leo. His anger collapsed, leaving behind something cold and empty. He looked from the broken painting to her face, his eyes hollow. The blustering, defensive man was gone, and in his place was a stranger, exhausted and defeated. "It's not just talking, Clara," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "It hasn't been just talking for a while." His confession was not an apology. It was a simple, brutal statement of fact. She stood there, her chest heaving, the rage receding and leaving a vast, glacial emptiness in its wake. There was only one question left, the one she had been most afraid to ask, the one she now had to know the answer to. "Do you love her?" she whispered, the words barely audible. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched for an eternity, thick with the ghosts of everything they had once been. He looked away from her, his gaze settling on the dark window, as if the answer were written in the reflection of the ruined room behind him. Finally, he closed his eyes, and a long, slow breath escaped his lips. He opened them again, but they were still empty. "Yes," he said, the word a final, fatal blow, delivered without pity. "I think I do." The air left her lungs, and she felt herself begin to sway. The shattered painting on the floor, the lie of their life, the two of them standing in the wreckage, it was all that was left. The truth had finally come out, not to heal, but to deliver the killing stroke. There was nothing left to say. There was nothing left at all. His final confession, the three simple words, "I think I do," did not echo. They were absorbed into the thick, wounded silence of the room, leaving a void more profound than any sound. The anger, the shouting, the violence of the shattered painting, it had all been a storm that had passed, leaving behind this cold, quiet, irreparable landscape of ruin. There were no more tears to cry, no more accusations to hurl. They were two strangers standing on opposite shores of a chasm that had just opened between them, and the only thing left to do was to acknowledge its permanence. The decision for him to leave was not a discussion. It was a physical law, an inevitability as certain as gravity. Their shared life, their shared space, had become a paradox, and it could no longer contain them both. Without another word, Leo turned and walked into the bedroom. Clara remained frozen, a statue carved from grief, and listened to the sounds that followed. It was the sound of their life being methodically dismantled. The soft scrape of a dresser drawer opening, the rustle of cotton t-shirts being pulled from a shelf, the metallic slide of hangers in the closet they had shared, a space that had always seemed too small but now felt cavernously empty. He was erasing himself from the narrative of their home, and she did nothing to stop him. She couldn't. To plead, to bargain, to fight now would be an act of profound self-deception. It would be pretending there was something left to save. And she knew with the cold, hard clarity of the truly heartbroken that there was nothing. She just sat on the sofa, her arms wrapped around her own waist, holding herself together as she watched the man she loved pack a bag to go to another woman. He moved through the apartment like a ghost, a polite visitor gathering his belongings. He went into the bathroom and she heard the small, distinct clinks of his toothbrush, his razor, his bottle of aftershave being placed into a wash bag. Each tiny, mundane sound was an act of surgical separation, a severing of the daily intimacies she had taken for granted. He returned to the living room, his face pale and grim, and his eyes fell upon the corner that had served as his studio. This was the most painful part of the ballet. He knelt, his movements stiff, and began to gather the tools of his trade. The brushes she had helped him clean, the palette knives, including the expensive one she had bought him as a surprise, the tubes of Winsor and Newton paint, their vibrant colors a mockery in the gray, funereal atmosphere of the room. He was packing up her sacrifice, her 16-hour days, her belief in him, and putting it all into a canvas tote bag to take with him. He stood before the large, unfinished canvas he had been working on, the one he had been so excited about just a few days ago. He reached for it, then stopped. It was too big, too awkward to carry with his other bags. Or perhaps, in some small, buried part of his soul, he knew he had no right to take it. He let his hand drop. He would leave that piece of their failed dream behind. He zipped his duffel bag, the sound loud and final in the suffocating silence. He had 2 bags in the canvas tote. He was ready. He walked to the door, hesitating for a moment with his hand on the knob. He looked back at her, his face a mask of miserable, inadequate regret. "Clara," he started, his voice cracking. I am so sorry." The words were meaningless, an insult. Sorry for the lies? Sorry for the betrayal? Sorry for destroying her? She didn't answer. She just looked at him, her gaze empty. There was nothing left inside of her to give him, not even the satisfaction of her anger. A slow, single nod was all she could manage. It was permission. It was dismissal. It was goodbye. He seemed to shrink under her silent gaze, and then he turned, opened the door, and stepped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut, a sound of absolute finality. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs, each one heavier than the last, descending, until they faded into the indifferent hum of the city night, and then there was nothing. She was alone. The silence that rushed in to fill the space he had occupied was a physical presence. It was a pressure in her ears, a weight on her chest. It was not the peaceful quiet of an empty house. It was the dead, sterile silence of a tomb. It was deafening. For a long time, she didn't move. She just sat there, listening to the sound of nothing. Then, as if waking from a long and terrible trance, she stood up. Her movements were slow, her limbs heavy, as she began a tour of the wreckage. She walked into the bedroom and stood in the doorway. His side of the bed was starkly empty. She could still see the faint indentation on his pillow, a ghostly impression of the man who would never sleep there again. The absence was a physical wound, a hollow space inside her own body. In the bathroom, the gap on the shelf where his things had been looked vast, a missing tooth and a familiar smile. In the kitchen, his favorite coffee mug, the one with a chip on the rim, sat by the sink, an abandoned artifact from a lost civilization. She returned to the living room, her eyes drawn to the 2 focal points of her new reality. First, the shattered painting on the floor, its splintered frame and torn canvas a brutal, tangible symbol of the night's violence. Then, her gaze shifted to the large, unfinished canvas he had left behind. It was a landscape of their life, half-formed, full of promise, and now, permanently abandoned. She walked over to it and reached out a trembling hand, her fingertips brushing against a patch of dark blue paint that was still slightly tacky. The faint, familiar smell of turpentine rose from the canvas, a scent she had always associated with his passion, with their dream. Now, it was the smell of abandonment. She didn't cry. The tears were gone, burned away by the raw intensity of the confrontation. This was something deeper, a grief so profound it existed in a place beyond tears. It was a hollowing out of the soul. She sank back onto the sofa, into the same spot she had occupied for hours, but the waiting was over. There was no one to wait for anymore. The apartment, once their home, their sanctuary, their shared world, was now just a collection of rooms, a silent container for her and the echoes of him. The city lights began to blur through the window, not from tears, but from a weariness so complete it felt like the beginning of death. The only sound in the deafening quiet was the new, unfamiliar echo in the empty room, the solitary, lonely beat of her own heart. 6 months. Half a year can feel like a lifetime or no time at all. For Clara, it had been both. The initial weeks after Leo left were a blur of profound, hollow shock. A period of just functioning, of putting one foot in front of the other, of moving through a world that had lost all its color. But slowly, tentatively, she had begun to reclaim her life, one small, deliberate act at a time. The first and most significant act was quitting the cafe. Walking out on her last night, handing over the keys she had carried for years, felt like a liberation. It was a declaration that her nights, her energy, her exhaustion now belonged only to her. She focused on her design work, taking on clients she actually enjoyed, her creativity slowly returning like a fragile, springtime thaw after a long, brutal winter. Her apartment transformed. She scrubbed it clean from top to bottom, as if trying to exorcise his ghost from the very floorboards. She packed away his remaining books and photos into a single cardboard box that now sat in the back of her closet. The oppressive, ever-present smell of turpentine was replaced by the clean, simple scent of lemon and lavender. The space was no longer a chaotic artist's studio masquerading as a home. It was the quiet, orderly sanctuary of a woman living alone. Only one monument to her old life remained. The large, unfinished canvas he had left behind still leaned against the living room wall. She had covered it with a plain white sheet. It was a ghost she knew she had to deal with, but she wasn't ready yet. Some days, she could forget it was even there. Other days, its presence was a silent, monolithic accusation. It was a Tuesday evening in late spring. The windows were open, and the sound of a distant saxophone drifted in on the mild air. Clara was finishing a simple dinner of pasta and salad, her laptop open on the small kitchen table. She had finished her work for the day and was idly scrolling through a design blog. The mindless clicks, a soothing, meditative rhythm. A link in the sidebar caught her eye, an article from a prestigious online art journal. The headline was something about the resurgence of neo-expressionism. She clicked, curious. And that's when she saw him. It wasn't a big photo, just a small one embedded in the article, but it stopped her breath. The headline above it read, "Isabel Gallery's new protege, Leonardo Vance, takes the art world by storm." Leonardo Vance. He had shed his simple, familiar name for something grander, something that fit his new life. The photograph was a masterpiece of curated success. Leo stood, beaming, in front of a massive, vibrant painting. He looked different, tanned, healthier, his hair artfully styled. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her old rent. Beside him stood Isabel, poised and elegant in a shimmering silver dress. Her hand was placed possessively on the small of his back, her smile one of triumphant pride. They weren't just standing next to each other, they were a unit, a formidable alliance of talent and power, their bodies angled towards each other in a way that excluded the rest of the world. Clara's eyes, however, were not on them. They were on the painting. It was his Brooklyn Nocturne, the one he had started in their living room, now finished. It was magnificent. The streaks of gold and blue were more vivid, the shadows deeper, the sense of urban melancholy so powerful it seemed to emanate from the screen. It was a masterpiece. And its foundation, the very bones of it, was a lie. Her mind flashed back with a sudden, searing clarity. She remembered the day she had bought that enormous, pre-stretched canvas. She remembered counting out a thick wad of crumpled one and $5 bills from the cafe's tip jar, her hands smelling of coffee grounds and disinfectant. She remembered the struggle, the two of them laughing and cursing as they maneuvered the awkward frame up the 3 narrow flights of stairs to their apartment. She remembered the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the staple gun as he'd restretched it, the sound echoing through a home that had still been filled with hope. Staring at the photo of him standing so proudly in front of his triumph, a triumph built upon a foundation of her labor and her love, she waited for the familiar sting of tears, the hot surge of anger. But nothing came. The wound was too old, the scar tissue too thick. What she felt instead was a strange and profound emptiness, a cosmic sense of erasure. She saw the truth with a final, chilling clarity. She had not just been betrayed, she had been rendered invisible. She was the scaffolding that had been torn down and hauled away after the magnificent building was complete. Her name would never appear in an article. Her sacrifice would never be acknowledged. In the official celebrated story of Leonardo Vance, she simply did not exist. Her hand moved slowly, almost of its own accord, to the trackpad. She clicked the small X at the top of the browser tab, and the image vanished. Then, she closed the laptop. The screen went dark, becoming a black, polished mirror. In it, she saw her own reflection, a pale, solemn face floating in the dim light of her quiet kitchen. The shadows under her eyes were still there, a permanent reminder of years of exhaustion, but her expression was different now. The desperate hope was gone. The raw, open pain was gone. In their place was something new, a stillness, a quiet, resilient strength that had been forged in the crucible of her heartbreak. She had survived. She looked away from her own reflection and towards the sheet-covered canvas still leaning against her wall, a ghost of a life that was no longer hers. The story was over. He had gotten his dream, and she had gotten her life back. It was a smaller, quieter life, but it was hers. And as she sat there in the silent apartment, a single, haunting question lingered in the air for no one but herself. When you pour everything you have into building someone else's dream, and they walk away with it, what are you left with? The answer, she was beginning to understand, was both simple and infinitely complex. You are left with yourself.